Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we're going to turn the utility box 2.0. We released the video on turning the utility box a little while ago, and there were a few design changes after having used the box that I wanted to improve, but I wanted to spice things up a bit and do a little more advanced project. So this is the utility box 2.0, and you can see the shape of it as well as the design features and some of the other things we've incorporated into the piece really make it stand above the standard utility box. With the standard utility box, it's got a fairly modern, basic shape. And one thing I didn't really like was this shoulder here. It catches all the salt and spices that you put in the box and doesn't allow that lid to sit nice and flat. So I wanted to change that on the 2.0 box. The other thing too is I wanted to make a more complex shape and something that looked a little more elegant when you put it out on display. So if you take a look at this one, we're actually using the coin box blanks, so it gives me a little bit thicker base, as well as a little bit larger diameter, and allows you to do some really fun designs and incorporate some different shapes and profiles. The other biggest thing too is we've gotten rid of that little shoulder on the rim, and we've gone to a rounded interior. That helps all the things you put inside funnel to the center and makes it easier to get them out. We've gone with a pretty thin wall thickness here, so the box is nice and light, but it's still a good size and a really good volume for putting stuff into. Let's get through the turning process and I'll show you those tips and tricks to take your box to the next level. Alright, for our blank selection I've got some nice kiln dried cherry. We definitely want to use kiln dried material, and for the base of this box it's going to be a 5x3, and for the lid it'll be a 5x2. So this size of material gives you a lot of design possibilities, and you can make it taller or shorter depending on what you like. So make sure your material is kiln dried, and then this is cross grain orientation, so just like a bowl grain. And then on the bottom of the box, I've got this already pre-drilled from my 3-in-1 screw chuck. So I'll set the lid aside, and we can get this mounted. So we'll get our safety glasses on. Make sure you wear your proper safety equipment. And then I like to start the lathe at the slowest speed it'll go, and then I'll thread this on. And then let it take it out of your hands once it bottoms out, and then we can just tighten it down. Set our tool rest for center working height, and then I'll bring up my tailstock. And because I'm not sure how tall I want to make this right now, I don't want to put this 60-degree cone and just drive that in there because that'll damage basically a 1/4 inch of material. So I'll use my little ring turning chuck bushing here just as a spacer. You know, you can also use one of the cup center revolving centers. Those are really nice, but this works well if you only have a 60-degree cone. So once you have everything set up, let's turn our lathe on. Everything seems to be running pretty close to true, so I'll be turning around 1500 RPM, and we'll start getting our rough profile here. So we've got a nice radius, and we'll leave room for the bead on the top and the bottom, and that's what we'll be shooting for, is that shape. So I'll get my bowl gouge and we'll just start removing some material. Okay, now we can adjust our tool rest in just slightly. And then I do want to put my 10 in here for my chuck jaws. I'll be using the 2.5 chuck jaws on my VM120. I'll use my skew to create a nice little dovetail. Alright, got a nice face and shoulder here, good taper on our dovetail, should match our chuck jaws really nice. Bring my tool rest over slightly. We'll start going for that shape. I want this to close in a little bit before that bead. And we'll do a nice little shear scrape to clean up that surface. And right now I'm not looking for my final exterior because we'll flip this around, hollow out the bowl, and then once the interior is done, we can mount it on our lid as a jam chuck and get our exterior to our perfect shape that we want. But once we have this roughly profiled and we have a nice tenon, we can remove this and we'll put it in our 4-jaw chuck. But you can see there's just a little bit of a mark from the bushing, but there's no ruined material here, especially if you're close to your height that you're looking for. It's always good to use a nice little spacer or bushing there. We've taken the 3-in-1 screw chuck off the lathe, and now we'll put on our 4-jaw chuck. Give that a nice little seat there. And then we'll mount this in our chuck jaws. One thing is when you're mounting your piece in your chuck jaws, it's always good to take a look at the gap between the chuck jaws and the surface. If there's a big gap there, that means that shoulder isn't cut correctly or the dovetail is not cut correctly. And if you have any gaps between there, that means you're not having a good seat with your chuck jaws and the piece could come out of the lathe and it's not gripping as well as it should. So you want to make sure that your tenon is cut nice and you have a nice flat square shoulder there for those chuck jaws to register against. So we'll turn this on, make sure it's spinning true. It's running nice and true there. So now we can face off the front of the blank and then we can hollow it out. Just make sure my chuck jaws are nice and tight. I like to do both the pinion gears myself. And then we can set up our tool rest. All right, to face this off, I've got my flute closed, basically at the 9 o'clock position. And it's just a nice little peeling cut. All right, that's nice and trued up. I didn't have to remove a lot of material. We'll get rid of my revolving center so I don't bump into it. And now we can start hollowing out the bowl. So I want to make sure my flute's closed. Get that cut started to where I'm on the bevel, and then I can open up the flute a little bit. Again, flute closed. Once I'm on my bevel, I can open that up and swing my tool handle around. And right now we're just trying to remove the bulk of that material, and then we'll get to our final wall thickness and our depth. But right now we're just trying to remove that material. Alright, I'm going to stop and check my depth real quick. I want to make sure that I'm not going to go too deep if I do have to shorten this up a little bit depending on the dimensions I want to have for a final box. So I'm just going to take my chuck key and just eyeball that edge. So I've got another 3/4 of an inch or so we can hollow out. As far as the design of our box goes, I'm going to have a slightly undercut rim here at the opening, and then we'll just have a nice gentle flowing curve down to the center. That'll help all the spices and salt, whatever you put in the box, funnel down to the center, and then that undercut rim will help us with the jam chuck fit. If this flares open at the top, we can't get a very good jam chuck fit when we go to remount this. So make sure it's either nice and straight at the very opening, or it has a slight undercut to the rim. With the bowl gouge, and remember we start with that flute closed. Once you're on the bevel, then you can open it up slightly. And then we do a nice swinging arc motion. So I drop the handle a little bit, swing it towards me, and then I bring it towards myself, and then I finish on center. So I'll be bringing that tool handle up. Once I'm close to that center, I bring that handle up and then finish the cut. Okay, let's check our depth again. I think we're getting kind of close to where we need to be. Yeah, I got another, I'd say 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. We can keep going. So I'm actually going to switch now to get this nice flowing curve on the inside. I'm going to go to my nice heavy box scraper. So we'll put our bowl gouge down for a minute. And with this scraper, I've got a 3/4 bar, so it's nice and stable. I don't get a lot of chatter out of the tool. And then I have a nice flowing, gentle French curve is what they call this. This allows me to get in there, get the undercut, get a nice flowing curve without getting too much cutting edge contact. A lot of those standard round point scrapers, you engage too much cutting surface and they get really grabby. But with this profile I have on my scraper, it's really easy to control and get a nice flowing continuous curve on the inside. Alright, let's take a look at that curve and see what we have. This should be cutting fairly clean. It's a nice sharp scraper. It's got a standard grind on it and not a negative rake, so it should be cutting really clean. And right now I just want to feel the contour of the curve and see if there's any bumps or undulations or any flat spots in there that I need to smooth out. But you can see I've got that nice undercut here at the rim. It's going to help us with our jam chuck fit later on. And now I'm just going to double check that depth one more time, see exactly where we're at. Okay, we can keep going a little bit further. And one thing I like to do is I put my forearm on top of the tool handle. That way if it does start to get grabby, I'm preventing it from getting out of control. And then I can get that back under control if it starts grabbing. Okay, I've got a pretty good curve in the bottom third of the bowl. It's got a little bit bumpy right here. We can smooth that out in a sec. Alright, stop and check that. Okay, that feels pretty good. There's just a tiny little ridge right here I'll get rid of. We can check our depth one more time. Okay, we're almost there. I don't want to go too deep in this because I will be changing the overall height of this once we put it on our jam chuck and getting that bead we want on the bottom of this. And I might have to shorten up the top of this just a little bit to get that bead as well. So keep an eye on your dimensions and what your design shape and everything you're looking for. Okay, I think we're just about there. I got rid of that ridge here on the top opening of the box. And our height's looking pretty good because I will shorten this up just a little bit. And so now that we have our curve the way we want, I want to get this to cut clean. If I move the tool rest, I've got just a little bit of tear out down here in the bottom. And I want to get that as clean as possible to minimize my sanding time. So one thing I can do to minimize the tear out is I'll get some paste wax. This is just scratch free. I'll pack it into that torn grain. And then we'll turn on the lathe and we'll bump up our speed just a little bit. And then we'll do one more pass. Putting that wax into those torn fibers helps support them to be cut cleanly. So we should get a lot better surface. So I'll bring my tool rest back in and move my bowl gouge out of the way. So I'll turn our lathe back on and we'll bump up the speed about 10%. So right now we're at about 1700 RPM, and I'm just going to do a light finishing pass to try and cut through that torn grain and give us a nice clean surface to sand. All right, if we stop the lathe and take a look, that's definitely gotten rid of a lot of that tear out in there. There's just a teeny bit left. I need to cut a little bit deeper, so I'll get just a little more paste wax and do one more pass, and we should be right there. Okay, that looks pretty good. I think we're ready to sand now. So I'll get my drill out and we'll start with some 180 grit paper, see if that's refining the surface enough. If we need to, we can drop down. But I think that surface is pretty clean and we can start with 180. All right, so I've got my power drill here and a 2-inch disc holder. And with this drill, it goes really fast. The RPM on this is way too fast for sanding on wood turning. So I have to be really careful with the control on this to keep the speed down. And then we'll also drop the speed down on our turning. We're down about 500 RPM on here. And I want to be careful with the speed control on the drill. And right now I'm just feathering that drill back and forth, trying to smooth out the surface, get rid of those torn grain or any surface imperfections we have, and just refine the surface that we've left behind off of our scraper. One thing I see a lot is guys will use these power drills and they'll kind of stay down in the bottom of the piece. And because it's sanding on the up and the downswing of the piece, it kind of wallows it out and creates a little indentation down in the bottom. So whenever you're sanding across the bottom, make sure it's a nice, smooth, continuous motion and you aren't staying there too long. Just try and clear out some of that dust. Feel the surface on the interior, make sure it's nice and smooth. I've got a nice gentle flowing curve down in the bottom. I've gotten rid of our tear out, but I can feel just a little bit of a ridge right in here. So I want to try and sand across that and smooth it out. Okay, that feels nice. So I'll switch to my 220 now. And we'll sand this up to 320, and then we'll hit the interior with our scratch free, because once we finish this step, we're not going to be turning the inside of the bowl anymore. So we want to get that surface nice and perfect and ready to be done. And now we can switch to our 320. I'll set these up here so we can reuse them later. Okay, and now we can set our drill down. I'll get my scratch free back out and I'll bump up the lathe speed. So I'll put a hefty dollop of scratch free in here, and now we can just bump up our speed and use that paper towel to let the abrasive and the scratch free do its work and refine that surface. Right now the speed's out about 800 RPM. You can go a little bit higher if you want. Well, let's stop the lathe and take a look. So if we inspect the surface, we've got a nice flowing curve on the inside, no torn grain, and that surface looks really sharp. The other nice thing too is that scratch-free brings out that really nice natural color of cherry and gives it a really smooth surface. So just double check this before we move on, because this is the last time you'll be able to turn this without having to remount it in your chuck. All right, so there was one step that I forgot. I do want to have this be slightly concave here on the rim, and I want to sand and finish the rim as well, because once we mount it on our jam chuck, we won't be able to access that. So I'll shear scrape the surface, and then I'll just hit that with my sander and some scratch free, and then we'll be done with the rim. To shear scrape, I'm going to drop that handle way down, and I'll be cutting on this long wing. So I've got my handle really low. Need to bring our speed back up. And then I'm just going to lightly skim that surface. That shear cut is very easy to control and leaves behind a really clean surface. So I'll actually just sand with my 320. And we'll drop that speed back down to about 500 RPM. And then we can hit that rim with our scratch free as well. So we'll bring that speed back up. All right, now we have a nice finished surface on the interior and the rim. So now that we're done with the interior, we'll mount our lid onto our screw chuck, and then we can use that as a jam chuck for the body and finish turning the exterior, getting our curve the way we want, as well as getting the bead cut on there for the foot and the rim. All right, so I'll set my scratch free off to the side, and I'll get my drill with my drill bit for the screw chuck. And what I'll do with the screw chuck is I've got a shim here to shorten this up. I don't want to have the full length of the woodworm screw in this piece because it'll go through the lid, because we will be shortening this down quite a bit. So I'll thread on my shim, and that's going to leave me about 3/8 of screw chuck exposed. So when I drill this, I want to make sure I don't go too deep, and that it's just deep enough for the amount of screw that we have exposed. So we'll get our screw chuck back on with the shim. Give that a good seat, and then we can turn this on at our really slow minimum operating speed, and we can thread on our lid. Once that bottoms out, let it go. You don't want to hold on to that piece because these sharp edges will cut you. All right. Now we can set up our tool rest, and then we'll cut a small taper on here to find out what the open diameter of this is, and then we can get a nice jam fit with our lid. So if we give ourselves a slight taper on the piece and we bring our speed down a little bit, we should be able to just get a nice burnish line. You can see where it's kind of shiny right there. That's going to be the open diameter, so we can start making our shoulder from there. All right, let's stop and give that a check. Okay, that's pretty close. That wants to slide over, but I don't want to split this piece either. So we'll remove just a little bit more material. And I'll actually grab my skew for this. That way I can have a nice square shoulder here. wants to go over just a little bit too big still. All right, we'll get our skew into a couple more cuts and get this right on the money. Okay, so it's just barely going on. And if I jam fit that, it's gonna probably split the bowl. So just one more pass and we'll be right there. Okay. So I don't know if you heard it when I put the piece on, it kind of sounded like you're stepping on snow, it kind of crunches. That's a good fit. So that's gonna be a work holding fit. I can turn the piece on, it'll stay, but it's not so tight it's gonna split the wood. If your fit on there is a little too loose, you can support it with the tailstock for the majority of the turning process, but you'll have to power sand the foot after it's off the lathe if your fit's too loose. Or you could try and bring it up if you have enough material here, you could cut a new tenon or a new jam chuck for it. So there's a couple different options if you didn't get the sizing right, but that's right about where we want to be. So for the turning process, however, I will bring up the revolving center just to give me a little extra support. That way if I have a catch, this thing doesn't come off the lathe on me. So let's bring up our revolving center, and we'll be using that bushing here because I want to save as much of this material as possible. Okay, so I've got my little bushing. We'll slide this in. And then just a little bit of torque. I don't need to get really crazy on the tailstock pressure, just enough to keep this engaged on the piece and so it doesn't come off. And so right now, because we don't need our dovetail on this end anymore, we can start going for that beaded foot and we can get the sizing right on that. I think that's gonna be pretty close to the bead, so I'll just square this off, get rid of the taper on it, and then we can cut our bead into there as well as get the bottom radius to match that inside curve so we have a nice uniform wall thickness all the way down. I'm gonna bump my speed up. I forgot I was a little bit slow from sanding. I was gonna say it wasn't cutting as well as it should, so I'm gonna bump that speed up. Get rid of that taper completely so we can cut our bead. And right now I'm just looking for a nice flowing curve down here to the bead. And that surface was just a hair out around, so I'm just cleaning that up. And I'm gonna get this rim here kind of closed in just a hair. And I'm always paying attention to my horizon here. I'm not looking at the cutting edge, I'm looking at the horizon and the shape that we're getting using the tool. Now I can shear scrape this. I'm pretty happy with that curve. I just want to smooth it out. So I've dropped my handle down. I'm cutting on that bottom wing. And now we can grab our beading tool. So this is the 3/16 beading cutter from Easywood Tools. This is a really quick way to do beads on a piece, and it cuts really clean as well. As I'm cutting that bead, I just swing the handle left to right. And then just let the wood come off onto the cutter. I don't want to force that in there or else it's going to tear out the fibers on the bead. And you can see that bead slowly starting to form. Perfect. So you can see there's a little bit of a cut there from the edge of the cutter. So we'll smooth that out, and then we can cut down this foot just a little bit. So I'll shear scrape that. And if you need to, you can always go to your spindle gouge to get down into that corner where the bead is, where the bead meets. And when I get down into the corner of that bead, I would close that flute entirely because I'm cutting just on the tip of the tool, because I don't want to cut the bead with the wing of the tool here. So I want to get down in there and just kind of use the tip of that to clean up that surface where that curve meets our bead. I can remove this excess material down here on the bottom of the bead. I want this foot to be undercut so it's registering on the largest outside diameter of that bead. And then I just want to double check my curve. I think it's a little heavy right here, so we'll remove some more material. So I can come in from this side. The fibers aren't going to be as supported, so it might tear out a little bit on you. Okay, I think that curve looks a lot better there. Okay, I'm going to neck this bead down at the rim. We'll get our beading cutter now, and we'll cut the bead for the rim. Just swing that handle back and forth until you get that nice established bead profile. So if you look at the surface of the bead, by cutting it nice and easy, swinging the handle back and forth, it cuts really clean. If I go in there and just jam that tool in there, it's going to tear that fiber out, and then you can't really ever get rid of that without resizing the bead. So our surface looks pretty good. There's a teeny bit of tear out where I was doing a push cut uphill. That was giving me tear out because these fibers are unsupported. But we can shear scrape that and clean it up. And I'm really happy with the curve that we have here to our beads. I think it looks nice. And it should match the interior profile that we had. So I'll get rid of this little shoulder here from the beading cutter, get that nice and clean. We'll use our spindle gouge to do that. Then we can shear scrape the surface, and then we'll be ready to sand the exterior and then finish the foot. The reason I want to use my spindle gouge is because the bevel angle on this and the size of the tool will allow me to get in there and get a nice clean cut up to the bead. So you can see that spindle gouge allowed me to get in there and get a nice clean cut. Really good shoulder and surface there on the side of the bead. So now we'll go to our bowl gouge and we can shear scrape this surface, try and clean it up. Once I get about to the apex of the curve, I'll switch the tool handle and come from the left side, swing to the right. Alright, let's stop and take a look at that surface. So it's definitely cleaned it up a bit. There's just the tiniest little bit of tear out, and we can do the same wax trick that we did on the interior. Just put a little bit of wax in there and we'll bump that speed up. I will also go to the grinder and give my bowl gouge a nice fresh edge, because the sharper the tool, the cleaner it'll cut for you. So hit the grinder and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've got a nice fresh edge on my tool. We've got the wax on the surface. And I'll bump that speed up about 10%, so we're about 1800 RPM. And now we should be able to shear scrape this nice and clean. Switch arms. All right, that definitely took care of a lot of that. I think I've got a couple more passes to go. Okay, that looks a lot better. Now we can sand that, so we'll take our tool rest, get this out of the way, get our tools moved. All right, so we're gonna go back to our 180, and we'll drop our speed down, about 500 RPM. And right now I'm just looking to refine the curve, and I wanna be careful not to sand these beads because this power drill will definitely reshape those beads really fast. So I just want to sand close to it, and then we'll hand sand down into the crevice here. We'll sand the bead as well by hand. So we'll take our paper off of the drill, and then just get down in those corners. Just lightly sand the bead. The surface is cut really clean off the tool, so I don't need to do a lot of sanding with that. Now we can go to our 220. Now we can move on to our 320. Now we'll bump that speed up and hit this with our scratch free. Use your fingernail to get down in that corner of the bead. And then we'll just buff that surface with a clean section of the rag. So before we remove our tailstock and we finish the foot here, I want to make sure that this surface is nice and clean, no tear out or any surface imperfections. But that looks pretty clean. So these beads are cut really nice. We got nice crisp corners to them. And now we can remove our tailstock and then finish the foot. And before I remove this completely, I want to do as much of the cutting as I can with that tailstock in place. So I'll get my spindle gouge and try and do a couple clean passes, and then we can get rid of the tailstock. So I've got my spindle gouge. Going for a slightly undercut foot, nice clean pass. Getting a little bit of chatter out of that tailstock because it was just a little loose. So I just snugged that up a little bit. And when you're doing these final passes down here with your spindle gouge, you really want to make sure that you have your flute closed when you start that cut, because right now, if I have the flute open, I'm going to have a skate and it's going to catch that bead, it's going to cut that really bad, and it might even skate up some of the surface that's finished. So you want to make sure that that flute's nice and closed, and then make the cut. And it looks like I've got a nice clean surface, a little bit of bevel indentation from just pushing a little too hard, but now we can remove that tailstock. Just going to turn that on and make sure everything's still running true. Make sure that we have a nice, good, solid work hold with our jam chuck. Sometimes that jam chuck will be tight, and then as you're turning the piece and removing some of the stress in the material and it getting hot and flexing, it might loosen up a little bit. So just double check your jam chuck before you start turning with the lathe on. So you can see I've got this small nub we need to remove, and I want to do pretty light, delicate cuts to do that, cut this off. I don't want to put a bunch of force on here because it's probably going to pop the piece off. So again, flute closed. Just nice and easy, really small passes. If you start hearing a bunch of chatter or noise coming out of the piece, that means it doesn't like what you're doing. So just slow down your cut or your feed rate and minimize the pass, do a little bit smaller pass. Okay, that surface is really clean, so I'll move my tool rest out of the way. We can grab our power drill. I'll just start with 220. We've got a really clean surface off that spindle gouge, so I think 180 is a little unnecessary. And again, you drop your speed down. We don't want to overheat the disc holder or the work surface. And just like the inside of the bowl, you never want to spend too much time right in the center because you wallow it out and you get a little indentation down there. So I'm always working back and forth across that surface, trying to keep a nice, smooth, continuous motion. Surface is really good, so we'll go to our 320. Okay. So that surface is ready for scratch free. And before I do that, I do want to do a couple of little decorative rings just to spice it up, make it look a little more elegant. So I'll bump our speed up, and then I'll use my skew, just the tip of it. Just cut a small little groove, and then I'll do one more right next to it. If you do 3 rings, it looks like a target, and it's hard to get those lines exactly evenly spaced. So doing 2 allows you a little more flexibility. But I think that adds a nice little decorative touch there on the bottom, and then it gives you a nice border to sign your name on the piece as well. All right, now just for the bottom, we'll get some more scratch free. Make sure to get that scratch free down in those detail grooves we just cut. Now we can pop this off. There we go. Okay, so we've got a nice, smooth, continuous curve on the interior. I would say just under a 1/4 inch wall thickness, because we have that bead sticking up here. But nice, smooth curve on the inside, no torn grain, and we have a really nice flowing curve on the exterior with these pretty elegant beads. So I'm pretty happy with the base on this. So we can set this aside now and then start turning our lid. All right, so I'll get my bowl gouge and just true this surface up. And the outside diameter of the bead on the base is pretty close to what this is once it's trued up. So I don't want to remove any more material than possible because I want these beads on the lid and the body to kind of meet up and be the same diameter. So we'll just true up the surface. Okay, we're pretty close. Okay, so we're nice and trued up there. I'm gonna shorten this up just a hair. And I'll grab the base, and I'm gonna put it back on the jamb fit, just to make sure my overall diameter for that, the lid on the bead is gonna fit. It's pretty close. I'll remove that taper we had when we were fitting the jamb chuck. And then I'll use my spindle gouge to get a nice clean shoulder here. If anything, do that slightly undercut. Now we can shorten up the shoulder for that lid because we don't need it to be that long. Still got a little bit to go. I only need that shoulder to be about 1/8 of an inch, 3/16. So that's about the length we want on our tenon. And then as far as the design goes on the lid, I'll cut a very, very small recess for my 2.5 inch chuck jaws. And then we'll do an undercut lid here to try and remove some weight. And then we'll add a couple decorative rings to match the foot we have on the piece. Bring that tool rest around. Get a nice bevel riding cut. I'm actually going to bring that in a fair ways. Okay, now I'll cut my tenon for my chuck jaws. So I'm going to be cutting just a really shallow recess there, just like this, maybe 1/16 of an inch deep to 1/8 of an inch, because I don't need a super good work hold on this lid because we don't do a lot of roughing out on the lid once we flip it around. But I will get my chuck jaws and close these down and just make sure it fits, see if I need to open that up a little bit more. Okay, that's pretty close, just a little bit more and then we'll fit. And bring up my tool rest just a little bit. Now I can hollow this out a little bit more with my bull gouge. And then I can get my final contour with my scraper. Then I'll just clean up this surface as well. Okay, let's just double check our fit with our chuck jaws. So I'm just going to set the chuck jaws in there to make sure that they fit in the opening. Ooh, they're right there. One more cut and those will fit. Okay, that should be fitting in there good. Now I can expand those. Yeah, and that should hold our chuck just fine once we flip it around. So now that that's cut, let's get our drill out and we can sand this entire surface here, sand this corner in here, and then cut some nice detail lines. And then we can flip it around and we'll cut the exterior of the lid as well as the beads we want on the top for decoration. All right, and then on the inside of this, we'll start with 220. That's a really clean surface. You shouldn't need 180. If you sand with paper coarser than you need, you're going to be leaving scratches in the surface that you'll have to sand out later, and it'll take longer. Well, we need to drop our speed down about 500-600. We'll sand that tenon, the recess, and that little step right here by hand. Jump up to our 320. And now I'll get my skew and cut our nice decorative rings. So bump that speed back up. We'll do one out here on the exterior near the tenon. I'll do a couple down here in the center as well. Now we can get our scratch free. And I forgot to mention while I was doing it, but as I was shortening this tenon up, I cut it and reduced the diameter down so it wasn't a tight fit anymore. It's just a nice loose fit. That way when you're taking the lid off, it's a one-handed operation and you don't have to pull them apart. So I reduced that down just a little bit to where now it's just a nice, easy slip fit. So that surface looks nice and clean. We've got our decorative grooves. Just trying to clean out some of the wax in there. And then we can flip this piece around. But you can see that surface there. So by with the shape we have on the lid where we kind of opened that up a lot, I took a lot of material out so the lid will be a lot lighter. And then just adding these little decorative rings adds a nice touch. And this little recess here, most people wouldn't realize that's for work holding. But the nice thing is too, is you can always remount this and true it up later if the lid does move on you and gets tight. So, okay, so we'll put our screw chuck off to the side and we can mount our VM120 with the 2.5-inch dovetail jaws. You want to be really careful you don't drop this on the nice finished surface. I've done that a handful of times. Still never learn. So now we can expand that into the recess we cut. And then just nice and snug. We don't have to get crazy with it. Let's move our scratch free out of the way as well. So first thing I want to do is I will establish our bead right here, and then we can match our curves to it. So I'll get my beading cutter. We'll turn our lathe back on. We're back at that 1700 RPM or so. Just swing the handle back and forth. Okay, that looks pretty sharp. Now we can remove the bulk off the lid. I want to be really careful when I start getting near that bead. I don't want to hit it with my gouge. And then we'll do a kind of an OG profile with that bead on the top. Okay, and I'm not concerned about the drilled hole because we will open that up to make the knob a nice little tenon fit for that. So right now I'm just trying to get a decent curve and then I can cut my bead. So I'll get my beading cutter and just eyeball where you want that bead to be. And then just swing that handle back and forth. All right, now that we have that established, we'll remove material lower than the surface of the beads so those are proud, and we'll do a nice little OG curve there. Okay, our curve's coming along. Use that beading cutter to form that over slightly, and now we can cut into it. So that's not an ideal cut because these fibers are unsupported as I'm cutting up into that bead. That's really the only way we can get in there. So I'll do my best to cut this direction from the center outward. That way all those fibers are supported during the cut. But when you're trying to get in there, sometimes it's unavoidable. So just do the best you can. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that curve. I've cut it really well with that spindle gouge. Now I'll use my skew just to refine that just even more. Okay, I want to stop the lathe and take a look at what we have. It's got a really clean surface. You can see some tool marks on the surface. I do want to clean up the bottom of that bead there a little bit, but we've got a really clean cut here. This bead's looking pretty good. Okay, now I can remove the bulk out of the center here. And we'll come from the center to the outside of the bead. This cut's a little tricky because you're kind of freehanding it. But this is the only way to get into that corner really well with your spindle gouge. Okay, I'm just going to finish profiling that bead a little more. So right now I want to stop and take a look at my curves, see if I want to refine anything. I think we're a little heavy here on this curve, so I'll remove some more there, and then I can clean up this face here as well. So I'll use my skew to get into this corner. And just smooth that surface out a little more. And I'll use this to refine this curve out here on this a little more as well. Okay, I think that curve looks a lot better. It looks a lot lighter now. Had a fair amount of heft in that curve. Okay, and I think that's where we want to be. Got our shape, matches up really nice. So now let's go ahead, we'll sand the surface, get this all nice and cleaned up, and then we can open up this small hole for the knob we want to turn, and then we can switch this out and get our blackwood piece and then turn the knob to match. Alright, so I'll power sand the areas that I can without hitting those beads, and then we'll hand sand the rest. Drop our speed back down. Jump up to our 320. Okay, so I'll go to some sheet 320. I'm going to bump that up just a little bit now that we're not power sanding. Okay, that surface looks really clean. Those beads are nice and crisp. Really happy with that. We'll put our scratch free on now, and then we'll drill out this hole for our knob to go into. And I'll do the scratch free right now because I don't want to get scratch free down in the drilled hole once it's opened up. So we'll do the scratch free before that. Use your fingernails to get down in those grooves, and then we can get a clean rag and just buff the surface. Okay, the surface looks really good, so now I can get my drill chuck and my Forstner bit, and we'll open up this hole for the knob we're going to turn in just a moment. Alright, so I've got a 1/2 inch Forstner bit in my keyless chuck, and I'll be opening this up basically just short of the depth of the cutting head there, so I can drop my speed down. And that's all we need to do. Regular bit would probably work a little better because these Forstner bits like They don't like being drilled into a hole that has a small hole in it already. So you could use just a regular twist bit. We might have a little bit deeper of a hole, but we have plenty of material there. We won't go through the lid. So now we have a nice hole. We can turn a little decorative knob. I'll be using black wood. So let's get this out of our chuck. Just wipe off any of the dust. From the turning process. And now you can see we've got a really good lid. Nice pretty shape, some nice decorations. And this thing's ready for the knob to be put on. So, all right, so we'll take our 120 out. And I'll put in my VM100 with the pin jaws. And then I've got a small scrap of black wood. This is inch by 3 or so. It's just a little scrap piece I had laying around. I can use this for the knob material. I think it makes a nice contrasting knob to the lid. So just get that mounted. Snug it down nice and tight. So I'll get my spindle gouge. Need to bring my tool rest up slightly. And for sizing the tenon, what I like to do is when I'm using a Forstner bit like this, I'll bring it up and then just barely drill a hole to where those teeth on the Forstner bit cut me that nice 1/2 inch diameter that I need to turn the tenon to. Okay, now that my tenon's turned, I want to test fit it. Okay, need to reduce that diameter slightly. Give that just a little more taper. I'm actually going to just roll that over slightly. Test fit it again. Okay, and then we can reduce the diameter of that tenon just a little bit. It's just a little bit too large to fit in there nice and snug. I'll undercut this shoulder slightly as well. That way the blackwood sits nice and flush on the curve that we have on the lid. Okay, nice and snug fit. Press that on, and you want to have that concave surface on the shoulder there to match the curve of your lid so you don't have any gaps. It's hard to see on camera, but once we take this off and glue it in, you'll be able to see that we have a nice flush fit all the way around that. So I can take this off now. Now we can start working on the shape we want for the knob. I'll use my narrow parting tool to remove some material. That'll give me some space to get my gouge in there to round this over. Okay, I've got a nice curve there, my tenon's good. I've got my radius started, so now we can part this off and then we'll mount it with that little tenon in the chuck jaws to finish the top of the knob. So I'll use my parting tool. And then I'll support the piece. As I part that off, I'll support it. And then it'll part just off. So we've got a nice contour here. We've got our tenon to mount into the lid. And now we can mount this in our chuck jaws and finish that curve we have on the outside. All right, now we can use our spindle gouge to finish that radius on the knob. Okay, we're pretty close. Just want to refine this curve just a little bit. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that shape. Now we can sand it. I'll drop my speed down a little bit. I'll start with 220. We got a really clean surface off the tool. When you're sanding a piece like this, you want to be careful with your chuck jaws. Those can tear up your fingers pretty quick. And then I'll use my palm to sand this exterior curve here. It helps me get a nice, more smooth, gentle curve. Okay, now we can go to our 320. Okay, now we can use our scratch free to really refine that surface of the blackwood. It's going to shine up really well. Blackwood's a really good wood to turn because it polishes so nicely. So we'll bump our speed back up now. Now we can take that out of the chuck. So we've got a nice little knob there, nice gentle curve, good tenon to match our radius we have on the lid there. Now we can glue this in. Alright, so now we're ready to glue in the knob. I've got some thick CA glue. We'll just coat the opening of the hole and press this in, and then we'll be ready to put on our final finish. So I'll get the nozzle in there, just do a nice light coat. You don't want to go heavy because I don't want glue to come out of that drilled hole, and then coat that surface. So just enough to keep it on the piece. Put a little bit on the tenon itself. Just kind of coat that around, and then we can press in the knob. So make sure that's seated all the way down. You can see we don't have any gaps around that knob there in the lid. And now we're ready to put on our final finish, and we'll be using the tried and true varnish oil for this piece. But so far, I think it's turning out pretty good. So let's get the lathe bed cleaned off, wipe this piece down with a clean rag, and then we can put on our final finish. Alright, so now we're ready for our final finish. We'll be applying the tried and true. Our surface is nice and dust-free, ready to go. Now we can just wipe on a nice heavy coat, and then we'll let it sit for about 24 hours. I'll be doing 2 coats on this piece. You don't have to do 2 if you don't want to, but I'll do the heavy coat first. And then I'll come back in a few hours, wipe off any excess that's still sitting on the surface. We'll let that dry for 24 hours, and then we can put on another lighter coat. Really like the tried and true though. It really emphasizes the natural wood color, leaves it close to the wood grain type of finish, and it protects the piece for years of use as well. So get that oil down in all the nooks and crannies. And again, this first coat's kind of heavy. And then I'll come back in a couple hours and then wipe off any excess and then let it sit. Okay, I'll set that off to the side. We'll do the bowl now. Okay, I think all the surfaces are nice and coated. We'll leave this, let it sit for a few hours. We'll come back, wipe off the excess, and then we'll let it sit for 24 hours. So we'll see you guys in just a little bit. Alright, so we came back and we wiped away the excess, then we put a second coat on and let that cure for 24 hours. So this box is done. If you wanted to apply a top coat wax, you definitely could, but for this, I think I'm ready to be done with this project. I'm happy with the finish we have on there. All the surfaces are really nice and clean, and I really like the design of this new box. We've taken the utility box to the next level with a really nice aesthetic design on the outside, and we've done some design improvements on the inside. Really happy with how this turned out. Alright, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and learned some new tips and techniques and how to elevate this to the next level. Go ahead and leave a comment down below what you think of the new design changes and the aesthetics. If you liked the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.